Hastings, carrying with it the metallic tang of blood and the acrid smoke of 1,000 dying embers. In the grey half-light of dawn, ravens pecked at the remnants of what had once been the flower of English nobility, their harsh cries piercing the silence like accusations against heaven itself. Among the dead lay Harold Godwinson, the last Anglo-Saxon king of England, an arrow through his eye, or so the stories would tell. Standing over the carnage, his mail coat gleaming dully in the pale light, William of Normandy breathed deeply of the morning air. He had come far from the bastard boy of Falaise, and now, at last, he could taste victory on the wind. But to understand this moment, this pivot upon which the fate of two nations turned, one must journey back through the labyrinthine corridors of time to when William was nothing more than an unwanted child in a castle that echoed with whispers of shame. The year was 1028, and the bells of Falaise Castle tolled with a hollow, mournful sound that seemed to speak of secrets and sins. Duke Robert I of Normandy, called Robert the Magnificent by his admirers, and Robert the Devil by his enemies, had taken a lover beneath his station. Heleva was her name, daughter of a tanner, some said, though others whispered she was the child of an undertaker. The distinction mattered little to Robert, who saw in her dark eyes and quick wit something that the pallid daughters of nobility could not provide. When their son was born in the depths of winter, the castle stones seemed to groan with the weight of prophecy. William, for so they named him, entered the world with a cry that, according to the midwives, could be heard above the howling Norman gales. Even in his first moments, there was something about the child that spoke of iron will and uncompromising determination. His grip was strong enough to bruise the finger of any who dared test it, and his eyes, pale blue like winter ice, seemed to look beyond the immediate world into some distant realm of possibility. The circumstances of William's birth cast a long shadow over his early years. In an age where legitimacy was everything, bastardry was a brand that burned deeper than any physical mark. The other nobles' children would whisper "bastard" behind his back, and more than once young William's fists had to settle accounts that words could not resolve. Yet perhaps it was this very adversity that forged the steel in his character, tempering what might have been mere ambition into something harder and more enduring. Duke Robert, for his part, seemed to recognize something extraordinary in his illegitimate son. Despite the boy's uncertain parentage, Robert showered him with attention and began grooming him for leadership. The Duke would often take William on progresses through the duchy, showing him the lands that might one day be his, pointing out the strategic importance of river crossings and mountain passes, teaching him to read the loyalties of men in their eyes and gestures. The education of a future duke in 11th century Normandy was not a gentle affair. William learned to ride before he could properly walk, his small hands gripping the reins of increasingly spirited horses as his father watched with approval. He studied warfare not from books, but from observation, standing silent in the great hall as Robert held court and settled disputes that often involved questions of blood and honor. The boy absorbed these lessons like dry earth drinks rain, filing away each detail for future use. But Robert's greatest gift to his son was perhaps unintentional. In 1034, seized by a sudden religious fervor, or perhaps merely seeking to atone for a lifetime of violence, the Duke announced his intention to make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. It was a decision that would echo through history, though few recognized its significance at the time. Before departing, Robert gathered his nobles in the great hall of Rouen and, with a solemnity that silenced even the most boisterous of his knights, declared 7-year-old William his heir. The assembled lords, their faces grave in the flickering torchlight, swore fealty to the boy. Some did so with genuine conviction, recognizing in the child's bearing something that promised greatness. Others offered their oaths with mental reservations, already calculating the advantages that might come from a disputed succession. The seeds of future conflict were sown in that moment, though none could foresee the particular shape that conflict would take. Robert never returned from his pilgrimage. Death claimed him in Nicaea, whether from disease, poison, or the simple exhaustion of a hard life, none could say with certainty. Word of his passing reached Normandy like a cold wind, and with it came the wolves, human predators who saw in a bastard child's inheritance an opportunity for advancement. The next decade of William's life was marked by a constant struggle for survival that would have broken a lesser spirit. Count William of Arc, his great-uncle, immediately declared his own claim to the duchy. Guy of Burgundy, Robert's brother, mustered his supporters and pressed his own suit. The air of Normandy grew thick with intrigue and the promise of violence, and more than once William's guardians spirited him away from assassination attempts, moving him from castle to castle like a chess piece in a deadly game. These years of uncertainty might have crushed the boy's spirit, but instead they seemed to fuel a fire within him that burned ever brighter. By the age of 15, William had grown tall and strong, his shoulders broad enough to bear the weight of mail, his hands skilled with sword and lance. More importantly, he had developed an almost supernatural ability to read men's intentions, a talent honed by years of wondering which smile concealed a dagger. The young Duke's first real test came in 1047, when the Great Rebellion erupted. Guy of Burgundy and several other Norman nobles, deciding that a bastard child had no business ruling over legitimate men, raised their banners in open revolt. The rebels gathered at Valedon, confident in their strength and the righteousness of their cause. They had not, however, counted on the depths of William's determination or his willingness to seek aid from unconventional sources. In a move that shocked the Norman nobility, William rode to the court of Henry I of France, technically his overlord but traditionally an enemy of Norman independence. There, in the glittering halls of the French court, the young Duke prostrated himself before the king and begged for assistance. It was a humiliation that would have been unthinkable for most Norman lords, but William understood that pride was a luxury he could not afford. Henry, intrigued by the boy's pragmatism and perhaps seeing an opportunity to weaken Normandy by supporting a dependent vassal, agreed to provide military aid. The Battle of Valedon was William's baptism in fire, and the flames that day burned away forever any lingering traces of the uncertain boy he had been. The morning mist clung to the field like the breath of ghosts, and as the two armies faced each other across the trampled grass, there was a moment of perfect silence, the kind of quiet that comes just before thunder breaks. William, resplendent in mail that caught the early sunlight like scales, rode along the front of his line. At 19, he already possessed a presence that commanded attention. His voice, when he addressed his men, carried clearly across the field without strain, and and there was something in his bearing that spoke of absolute conviction. He told his soldiers that they fought not merely for their lord, but for the future of Normandy itself, and that God would judge the righteousness of their cause by the outcome of the day. When the charge came, it was like the collision of two thunderclouds. Lances splintered, horses screamed, and men fell like wheat before the scythe. William fought in the thick of it, his sword rising and falling with mechanical precision, cutting down any who stood between him and victory. Those who witnessed his performance that day spoke later of a young man transformed, as if the violence had awakened something primal and terrible within him. The rebels, for all their noble blood and righteous indignation, could not match the fury of William's assault. By midday, their line had broken, and Guy of Burgundy lay dead among the trampled banners of his cause. The victory was complete, but William's treatment of the survivors revealed the calculating mind behind the warrior's facade. Rather than order a general massacre, he showed mercy to those who submitted immediately while making examples of the most obstinate rebels. It was a strategy that would serve him well in years to come. The iron fist extended in apparent mercy but ready to close without warning. Victory at Valadoun established William's authority within Normandy, but it also taught him valuable lessons about the nature of power. He learned that strength alone was not sufficient. One must also cultivate the appearance of legitimacy, the aura of divine favor, and the practical loyalty of those who wielded swords in your service. The young duke threw himself into the business of governance with the same intensity he had shown in battle, transforming Normandy from a fractured duchy into one of the most efficiently governed territories in Western Europe. William's court became a magnet for ambitious young men from across the continent. He had an almost uncanny ability to identify talent and attract loyalty, binding promising knights to his service with grants of land and the promise of advancement. These men, Walter Giffard, Hugh de Montfort, and dozens of others, would become the steel backbone of Norman expansion, their names destined to echo through the halls of English castles not yet built. The Duke's approach to justice was as calculated as his military strategy. He instituted new laws that strengthened central authority while maintaining enough respect for traditional Norman customs to avoid rebellion. His courts became known for their efficiency and relative fairness, though no one doubted that William's will was the ultimate authority. He encouraged trade, fostered relations with the church, and began the construction projects that would transform the physical landscape of Normandy. But perhaps William's greatest achievement during these years was his marriage to Matilda of Flanders in 1053. The union, initially opposed by the Pope due to consanguinity concerns, was a masterpiece of political calculation. Matilda brought with her not only a substantial dowry and valuable political connections, but also the legitimacy that William's bastard birth had always denied him. More than that, however, the marriage proved to be a genuine partnership of minds. Matilda was every bit as intelligent and ruthless as her husband, and together they formed a formidable team that would reshape the map of Western Europe. The year 1064 brought with it an event that would change the course of English history, though few recognized its significance at the time. Harold Godwinson, Earl of Wessex and the most powerful man in England after King Edward the Confessor himself, found himself shipwrecked on the Norman coast while returning from what may have been a diplomatic mission to the continent. Whether his his arrival was accidental or planned remains one of history's great mysteries, but its consequences were undeniable. William received Harold with all the honor due to such a distinguished guest, housing him in the finest chambers of Rouen Castle and treating him as an honored ally rather than a potential hostage. The two men, both in the prime of life and both accustomed to command, took each other's measure during long conversations that stretched late into the Norman nights. Harold found in William a man of obvious ability and iron determination, while William recognized in Harold both a formidable potential opponent and a key to his long-cherished ambitions. For William had not forgotten the promise allegedly made to him years earlier by Edward the Confessor. The childless English king had supposedly designated William as his heir during a visit to the Norman court in 1051, a claim that few English nobles acknowledged, but which William held as sacred truth. Now, with Harold as his guest, the Norman Duke saw an opportunity to strengthen his position immeasurably. The oath ceremony took place in the Cathedral of Bayeux, amid circumstances that remain controversial to this day. According to Norman sources, Harold freely swore to support William's claim to the English throne, placing his hands upon relics of enormous spiritual significance and calling upon God to witness his vow. English chroniclers would later claim that Harold was coerced, that he was unaware of the nature of the relics involved, that his oath was invalid due to duress. The truth, like so many truths of that age, lies buried beneath centuries of conflicting accounts and political necessity. What cannot be disputed is that Harold made the oath, whatever its circumstances, and that William considered it binding. When Harold was allowed to return to England, he carried with him not only William's friendship, but also the weight of a sacred vow that would soon prove impossible to keep. The death of Edward the Confessor on January 5th, 1066, set in motion a chain of events that would culminate in one of the most famous dates in English history. On his deathbed, the king allegedly named Harold Godwinson as his successor, a designation that the English Witan quickly confirmed. Harold's coronation took place with unseemly haste the very day after Edward's funeral, as if speed might somehow legitimize what William considered an act of supreme treachery. The news reached Normandy like a thunderclap, and those who witnessed William's reaction spoke of a rage so cold and terrible that it seemed to freeze the very air around him. The Duke said little at first, but his silence was more ominous than any torrent of curses might have been. Here was betrayal of the most fundamental kind, the breaking of a sacred oath sworn before God and witnessed by men of honor. That it came from Harold, whom William had treated as a friend and honored guest, only deepened the insult. But if William felt betrayed, he did not allow emotion to cloud his judgment. Instead, he channeled his fury into meticulous planning, sending envoys across Western Europe to build support for his cause. To Pope Alexander II, he presented his case as a matter of ecclesiastical justice. Harold was an oath-breaker, a perjurer who had violated sacred vows. The Pope, perhaps swayed by William's arguments or possibly by more practical considerations, sent a papal banner to bless the Norman enterprise. Meanwhile, William's summons went out across Normandy and beyond, calling his vassals to their feudal duty and attracting volunteers from Brittany, Flanders, and even from as far away as southern Italy. The promise of English land and plunder drew men like iron filings to a lodestone, and by summer a great host had assembled along the Norman coast. Ships were built or weapons were forged in quantities never before seen, and provisions were stockpiled for what promised to be a campaign of unprecedented scope. The invasion fleet that finally set sail from Saint-Valery-sur-Somme in late September 1066 was a sight to stagger the imagination. 700 ships, according to most accounts, their sails bellying out like the wings of enormous seabirds as they caught the favourable wind that William's prayers had finally summoned. The Duke himself stood in the bow of his flagship, the Mora, a gift from his beloved Matilda, watching the white cliffs of England grow larger with each passing hour. Behind him sailed not merely an army, but the future nobility of a conquered realm. These were men who had staked everything on William's promise and their own courage, leaving behind the familiar fields of Normandy for the unknown possibilities that lay across the Channel. They carried with them not only swords and lances, but also the seeds of a new order, a Norman-French culture that would fundamentally transform English society. The landing at Pevensey Bay proceeded with remarkable efficiency, a testament to William's careful planning and the discipline of his forces, as the Norman knights led their destriers down improvised gangplanks onto the shingle beach, and as the archers and infantry formed protective perimeters around the growing beachhead, England's fate was already being written in sand and spray. William himself was among the first to leap from ship to shore, but in his eagerness he stumbled and fell face first onto the beach. For a moment, as his men watched in horror, it seemed like an omen of disaster. But the Duke, thinking quickly, grasped handfuls of English earth and rose to his feet with his fists full of soil. "See?" he called out in a voice that carried clearly over the crash of waves. "I have already taken possession of England with both hands." It was the kind of quick thinking that had made him master of Normandy, and it turned what might have been a moment of despair into one of triumph. The campaign that followed was a masterpiece of psychological warfare as much as military strategy. Rather than immediately marching on London, William established a base of operations along the south coast and began systematically ravaging the countryside. It was a calculated strategy designed to force Harold into premature action, and it worked exactly as William had hoped. Harold Godwinson faced an impossible situation. To the north, Harold Hardrada of Norway had launched his own invasion, claiming the English throne by right of an agreement with Magnus of Norway and Canute. Harold had been forced to march his army nearly the length of England to defeat the Norwegian threat at Stamford Bridge, a victory that came at enormous cost in both men and time. Now, barely 3 weeks later, he faced the necessity of marching south again to confront a fresh invasion. The English king's advisers counselled delay, urging him to gather more troops and give his exhausted army time to recover. But Harold, perhaps driven by pride or by the desperate knowledge that every day of delay allowed the Normans to strengthen their position, chose instead to force a quick decision. He gathered what men he could and marched south with a speed that would have been admirable had it not proven so fatal. The two armies met on the ridge at Senlac Hill near the town of Hastings on October 14th, 1066. The English position was strong, a hilltop with steep slopes that would break the force of cavalry charges, flanked by rough ground that would channel any attack into a narrow front. Harold's men, many still bearing the wounds of Stamford Bridge, formed a solid wall of shields across the ridge, their battle-axes gleaming in the morning light. Dawn broke grey and misty over the battlefield, and as As the morning light strengthened, the two armies could see each other clearly for the first time. The English stood like a human wall across the hilltop, their round shields overlapping in the formation. They called the shield wall, a defensive tactic that had served them well for generations. Behind the front rank, Thanes and Huskarls gripped their long-handled axes, weapons capable of cleaving through mail and helm with equal ease. Facing them across the valley, the Norman army presented a very different appearance. William had organized his forces in 3 divisions: Bretons on the left, Normans in the center, French and Flemings on the right. Each division was composed of 3 lines: archers in front, infantry in the middle, and the dreaded Norman heavy cavalry in the rear. It was a flexible formation that could adapt to changing circumstances, and it represented the cutting edge of 11th century military technology. As the sun climbed higher, William rode along his lines, his voice carrying clearly in the still air as he reminded his men of the justice of their cause and the rewards that awaited victory. He spoke of Harold's broken oath, of the papal banner that blessed their enterprise, of the rich lands that would be theirs once the day was won. The Duke's presence was itself a weapon. At 38, he was in the prime of life, a warrior whose reputation had preceded him across the Channel. The battle began with a hail of Norman arrows, the shafts whistling through the morning air to clatter against English shields or thud into flesh where gaps appeared in the shield wall. But the English position was too strong for archery alone to decide the day, and William soon ordered his infantry forward in the first of what would be many assaults against the ridge. The Norman foot soldiers advanced up the slope with grim determination, their shields held high against the storm of English javelins and stones. But as they approached the shield wall, they met a defense more formidable than any they had previously encountered. English axes rose and fell like mechanical devices, splitting shields and severing limbs with horrifying efficiency. Again and again the Normans charged, and again they were hurled back down the slope, leaving behind them a carpet of dead and wounded. By mid-morning, disaster seemed to threaten William's cause. The Breton division on the left had been so bloodily repulsed that rumors spread through their ranks that the Duke himself had been killed. Panic began to spread like wildfire, and the entire left wing started to crumble. It was the moment that would define not only the battle, but William's entire life. Rather than watch his army disintegrate, William spurred his horse forward into the thick of the fighting. Throwing back his helmet so that his face was clearly visible, he rode among his fleeing men, shouting that he lived and calling them back to their duty. "Look at me," he cried, his voice somehow audible above the din of battle. "I live, and by God's grace I will conquer." His presence steadied the wavering line, and slowly, grudgingly, the Bretons resumed their positions. It was then that William demonstrated the tactical brilliance that had made him master of Normandy. Recognizing that frontal assault alone would never break the English position, he ordered his men to attempt a feigned retreat. It was a dangerous maneuver that required perfect timing and discipline, but if executed properly, it might draw the English from their impregnable position. The ruse worked better than William had dared hope. As the Normans appeared to flee in disorder, groups of English warriors broke from the shield wall to pursue them down the slope. Once the pursuers were separated from the main body, Norman cavalry wheeled about and cut them to pieces in the open ground. Again and again this tactic was repeated, each time thinning the English ranks and weakening their formation. But Harold's men were veteran warriors, and they adapted quickly to Norman tactics. The shield wall contracted but held, and as the afternoon wore on, it became clear that neither side possessed the strength to achieve decisive victory. The battle had become a test of endurance, and both armies were reaching the limits of their strength. It was then that fortune, which had favoured first one side and then the other throughout the long day, finally declared for William. As evening approached and the light began to fail, Harold Godwinson fell, whether struck down by an arrow through the eye, as the Bayeux Tapestry suggests, or hacked to pieces by Norman knights, as other sources claim, matters little. What mattered was that the English king was dead, and with his death, the last hope of English resistance died as well. The news of Harold's fall spread through the English ranks like poison, and what had been an ordered retreat became a rout. The survivors fled into the gathering darkness, pursued by Norman cavalry whose horses' hooves drummed against the earth like thunder. By nightfall, the ridge that had been crowned with English banners was littered with English dead, and William of Normandy could truly call himself William the Conqueror. On Christmas Day, 1066, in the ancient Abbey of Westminster, William of Normandy was crowned King of England. The ceremony, conducted according to traditional English rites, but under the watchful eyes of Norman guards, marked not merely the elevation of a duke to royal status, but the birth of a new England. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, in one of its most poignant entries, recorded that a great mortality came upon mankind in that year, and indeed an entire world had died at Hastings. The years that followed would test William's character as severely as any battlefield. Governing a conquered nation required different skills than winning one, and the new king found himself walking a tightrope between the competing demands of his Norman followers and his English subjects. Rebellions erupted with wearisome regularity, each requiring the application of that mixture of violence and calculated mercy that had become William's trademark. The harrying of the North, that terrible winter campaign of 1069 to 70, would stain William's reputation for centuries to come. Faced with persistent English resistance centred in Yorkshire, the king implemented a scorched earth policy of such thoroughness that the region took generations to recover. Villages were burned, crops destroyed, and livestock slaughtered in a systematic campaign designed to crush English resistance forever. It succeeded, but at a cost in human suffering that even William's own chroniclers found difficult to justify. Yet, for all its brutality, William's conquest brought to England innovations that would prove transformational. Norman administrative efficiency, architectural ambition, and military technology revolutionized English society. The great cathedrals and castles that rose from English soil in the decades following 1066 bore witness to a new vision of what England might become. The Domesday Book, that remarkable survey of English wealth and resources completed in 1086, demonstrated a capacity for systematic governance that had no parallel in contemporary Europe. William himself changed as well, the successful conqueror gradually transforming into the careful administrator. The years softened neither his determination nor his capacity for ruthlessness, but they brought a certain measured deliberation to his actions. He learned to speak English, though haltingly, and made genuine efforts to understand the customs and traditions of his new subjects. The bastard Duke of Normandy had had become something unprecedented, a Norman king of England who was neither wholly Norman nor wholly English, but something new. In September 1087, death came for William as it came for all men, regardless of their crowns or conquests. Fatally injured during the siege of Mantes when his horse stumbled and threw him against his high saddle pommel, the conqueror lingered for several weeks in agony before finally succumbing to his wounds. Even in death, controversy followed him. His corpulent body proved too large for the stone sarcophagus prepared for it, and the attempt to force it into place caused the corpse to burst, filling the cathedral of Saint-Étienne in Caen with such a foul stench that the funeral service had to be hastily concluded. It was perhaps a fitting end for a man whose life had been marked by the triumph of will over circumstance, of determination over propriety. William the Bastard had become William the Conqueror through the simple expedient of refusing to accept the limitations that birth and circumstance had placed upon him. He had seized destiny with both hands and bent it to his will, creating in the process a new England and a new kind of kingship. The England that William left behind was fundamentally different from the one he had conquered. Norman French competed with English in the halls of power, while Latin dominated the churches and courts. Stone castles crowned hills that had never known fortification, and Norman lords held lands that had belonged to English families for centuries. It was a hybrid nation, neither Norman nor Anglo-Saxon, but something entirely new, a fusion of cultures that would eventually produce Shakespeare and Chaucer, Gothic cathedrals and common law, an empire that would span the globe. Standing in the ruins of Battle Abbey today, where the high altar once marked the spot where Harold Godwinson fell, it is possible to sense something of the magnitude of what occurred on that October day nearly 1,000 years ago. The wind that blows across the downs carries with it echoes of that distant conflict, and the very stones seem to whisper of the moment when one world ended and another began. William's victory at Hastings was more than a military triumph. It was the hinge upon which English history turned. The moment when the island nation's destiny was forever altered by the will of a bastard duke who refused to be denied his crown. In the end, perhaps that is William's truest legacy, not the castles he built or the lands he conquered, but the demonstration that determination, properly applied, could overcome any obstacle. The boy who had been scorned as a bastard had become the man who conquered a kingdom, and in doing so he had proven that in an age when birth seemed to determine everything, character could still determine more. The Norman conquest was complete, but its consequences would echo through the centuries, shaping not only England but the entire English-speaking world that would eventually emerge from William's hard-won victory. From the beaches of Pevensey to the throne of Westminster, from the blood-soaked ridge at Hastings to the quiet grave in Caen, William the Conqueror had written his name across the pages of history in letters that time itself could not erase. The tides of history rarely turn on the will of a single man, and yet, in the case of William, they bent beneath the weight of his determination. From the windswept battlements of Falaise to the blood-darkened slopes of Hastings, his life was a testament to a singular belief that destiny is not granted, it is seized. He was born the son of a tanner's daughter, a child marked by whispers of shame. He died a king of 2 realms, his name etched into the chronicles of both Normandy and England. But the price of such a life was steep. those who stood in his way. For William, victory was never enough. Each triumph brought with it the next challenge. Each crown had to be held as fiercely as it was won. And yet, for all the castles he raised, for all the charters sealed with his seal, his greatest legacy was not carved in stone, but woven into the living fabric of England itself. Before him, the kingdom had been Anglo-Saxon, proud, ancient, and deeply rooted in its own ways. When he left this world in 1087, it was something altogether new, a realm neither wholly Norman nor wholly English, but a hybrid kingdom, shaped by his hand and set upon a course that would echo across the centuries. He brought with him more than armies. He brought new laws, new customs, a new language in the halls of power. He brought the towering keep of stone to a land where wood had been king, and with the Domesday Book he bound the kingdom in the iron grip of order. Every field, every plough, every coin, recorded, measured, known. His reign was not gentle. The harrying of the north, that winter when fire and famine scourged Yorkshire, left scars that would not fade for generations. It crushed rebellion, but at a cost so great that even his own chroniclers hesitated to praise it. Still, the England he shaped endured. Every monarch who followed from Henry II to Elizabeth I inherited not only his crown, but also the central authority he had forged in fire. Every castle that still crowns an English hilltop is a silent sentinel of his will, each one whispering the same truth. This land was once bent to the rule of a foreign king. Even today, in the courts of law, in the names of towns, in the enduring power of the monarchy, traces of William's world still remain. It is tempting to see his life as a perfect arc, the bastard boy who rose to conquer a kingdom. But William's story is not the tale of a man who reached a summit and rested. His was a lifetime of climbing. Every victory led only to the next hill to take. Every horizon revealed another beyond it. And perhaps this is the heart of his legacy. That power is never a destination. It is only a vantage point from which the next battle can be seen more clearly. Nearly 1,000 years have passed. The wind still sweeps across the ridge at Hastings, whispering through the grass where Harold fell. The stones of Caen still stand, bearing the name of the king who built them. And somewhere in that space between legend and truth, the figure of William endures, helmeted, unyielding, forever reaching for the next horizon. For in the end, William the Conqueror was never simply a man of his time. He was a maker of times to come.